My name is Howard Ellison. I am 76 years old, and most days I wake up to the sound of my own breathing in an empty house that seems to echo back at me as though it wants to remind me that silence has become my only companion. I live in a modest 2-story house on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, Iowa, a house I once filled with the laughter of my wife Margaret, the crying of children, the sound of Sunday dinners, and the ordinary symphony of family life that, at the time, seemed like it would never end. The place is still tidy because I am a tidy man, a man who spent his life working as a machinist in the local factory where precision mattered and where my hands, though rough, were guided by a discipline I never abandoned. Every morning, I prepare my own breakfast, 2 eggs fried lightly, a slice of toast, black coffee with no sugar. I sit by the window at the kitchen table and watch the street outside, a street that has grown quieter with the years as old neighbors died or moved away, and young families filled the houses with children who no longer play in the front yards like ours used to. Sometimes the routine of my mornings feels like the only rope that holds me together, a fragile string connecting me to the man I once was when my days were full of purpose. I have one son, Daniel, who is 50 now and an attorney in Chicago. To speak of him is to press on a wound that never quite heals. When he was a boy, I remember him clinging to my arm whenever I came home from work, begging me to lift him high into the air and spin him around until he was laughing so hard his little chest rattled with joy. He was my pride, the very reason I endured long shifts, night hours, and the noise of steel against steel. Margaret used to say that Daniel had inherited my stubbornness, my way of always wanting to be right, and I smiled at the thought, believing then that stubbornness was a strength, a shield he would carry into life. Now, as the years have passed, I see that what I once called stubbornness hardened into something colder, a calculating edge that cuts even the hand that once fed him. He lives in a tall glass building, drives a foreign car, dresses in suits that cost more than my monthly pension, and whenever he visits, which is rare, he looks around my house as though it were a museum of obsolescence, something to be pitied rather than cherished. Margaret died 12 years ago, a slow cancer that carried her away over a span of months in which I learned both the depth of love and the cruelty of time. I was by her side every day, feeding her, bathing her, sitting awake through the long nights when pain made her moan softly into the pillow. I thought Daniel would come more often, that he would bring his wife and children, that he would understand his mother's last wish was to see her family together, but he was always busy, always at court or flying somewhere, and when he did appear, it was for an hour at most, his face lit by the glow of his phone, as though the world beyond our house was more important than the woman who gave him life. On the day we buried her, Daniel spoke politely, formally, like a guest at someone else's funeral, and I remember standing by the grave with my hand on the coffin, thinking that the bond between mother and son had already turned to dust before we even lowered her body into the ground. After Margaret's death, loneliness became a weight I carried like an invisible stone on my back. I tried to fill the days with small tasks, fixing the fence, repairing old tools, volunteering occasionally at the Veterans Hall though my knees make it difficult now. But nothing replaces the human presence, the sound of another voice in the rooms, the reassurance that when you turn your head, someone who knows you is there. Daniel rarely calls, and when he does, his words are clipped, efficient, businesslike, as if speaking to his father were another item to be checked off a long to-do list. The grandchildren, Lily and Marcus, are teenagers now. I have not seen them in almost 5 years, except in pictures Daniel's wife posted online, pictures where they smile in front of beaches or college campuses, as if their grandfather never existed. Sometimes I print those pictures on my old computer and tape them on the fridge, not because I believe it brings them closer, but because it reminds me that they are still out there, living, growing, moving forward, even if I am stuck in this house, like a clock that ticks but never chimes. There are evenings when the silence becomes unbearable, when the television no longer distracts me, and the books blur before my eyes. I take out the photo albums Margaret kept, heavy books with fading Polaroids, scribbled notes in her careful handwriting, tickets from fairs and baseball games taped on the pages. I trace my finger along her smile, along Daniel's boyish face, and I wonder if memory itself is a kind of betrayal, because it preserves what the present refuses to give. To remember love is both a blessing and a punishment. It keeps me alive, but it also reminds me daily of what I no longer have. Neighbors sometimes invite me over, but I decline. It is not pride. It is simply that I do not want to impose myself on people whose families are intact, whose children still call them for advice, whose lives feel vibrant, while mine has slowed to a crawl. I do not want to be seen as the lonely widower, the man with too much time and too few people who need him. My dignity is the last possession I have, and I cling to it even as the world, and sometimes my own son, seems determined to strip it away. I tell myself I am not bitter, that I have lived a long life, worked hard, paid my debts, and that the natural order is to fade quietly, to step aside as the younger ones take the stage. But in the middle of the night, when I wake with the creak of the house and the shadows pressing on my chest, I feel a burning in my heart, a question that will not leave me. Is this truly all I deserve after giving everything I had to family and work? Is silence the final reward for loyalty? My voice has grown quieter over the years, partly because no one asks for it, partly because I fear that if I raise it, I will be dismissed as a bitter old man who complains too much. Yet deep inside, I know that silence is not what Margaret would have wanted for me. She always told me, "Howard, you have a strong voice. Don't let the world shrink it." For years I thought she meant my singing, my silly baritone at church, but now I understand she meant something larger, that dignity has its own sound, and to die without using it is the true tragedy. When Daniel does visit, once or twice a year, he arrives with the air of a man doing charity. He stays in his fine clothes, does not even loosen his tie, and looks at the furniture as if dust itself were an offense to him. He asks questions about the house in a way that feels less like interest and more like inventory. Is the roof in good shape? How much is the property worth? Do I have a will prepared? He frames it as concern, but I see the gleam in his eyes that betrays calculation. He talks about retirement homes as though they are resorts, tells me about places where someone will take care of everything, and I won't have to worry. I tell him I am fine where I am, that this house is more than wood and walls. It is the shell of my life, the container of memories. He sighs as if I were stubborn, as if refusing to leave were selfish. Perhaps it is, but I know that once I leave this house, I will no longer be Howard Ellison, husband, father, worker. I will be a number in a file, a man who once existed, but whose story has ended. I do not hate my son. Hatred requires energy, a fire I no longer have. What I feel is something colder, like standing in a draft that never goes away. I love him because he is mine, because I remember the boy he was, the boy who fell asleep in my lap while I read him stories, the boy who cried when I left for work nights. But I no longer know the man he became, and I am not sure he knows me either. Between us stretches a silence heavier than words, a silence that one day will break in a way neither of us expects. Daniel called on a Wednesday, his voice brisk and polished the way it gets when he is shepherding a client through steps he has already decided for them, and he said he would be driving through Cedar Falls on his way back from Des Moines, that it had been too long, that we should have dinner together. And I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread settle in my chest, because these invitations always arrived with invisible footnotes attached, expectations about what a reasonable old man should agree to, and a carefully curated sense of concern that had less to do with my well-being than with the management of some future that he believed belonged to him. I cleaned the house more than it needed, pushed the vacuum across the same strip of carpet until the lines were straight and parallel like the passes of a plow, put fresh coffee on, although it was afternoon, and when he arrived, he stood in the doorway in a raincoat the color of wet asphalt, and let his eyes travel across the living room, as though he were taking inventory of a warehouse before an auction, nodding at the framed photographs and the mantel clock and the chair where Margaret used to fall asleep with a book. And then he smiled the gentle smile he gives to juries and to old men alike, and said he had made a reservation at the new place by the river because it would be quiet enough for us to talk. The restaurant was the sort that is proud of its restraint, low lights, candles that leave a stuttering halo on the water glasses, a piano murmuring something slow near the bar, and a menu that substitutes poetry for portions. We were shown to a table against the window, the Cedar River moving in a dark ribbon beyond, and I watched the reflection of my own face, hovering in the glass like a ghost seated with us. Daniel ordered for both of us without asking, which is his habit now, saying the trout would be better for me than the steak, and that I would thank him later. And when the server asked about drinks, I said I would like a small rye, because it comforts my chest on damp days. But Daniel shook his head and requested sparkling water with lime for us both. And then he turned his attention to the leather folder he had brought and set beside the bread plate, as if it were a third guest we might have to include in the conversation. He asked about my knees and about the roof and about whether the furnace had been serviced, and I answered politely, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe this might be ordinary. that a son might simply care about the condition of the house, where his father sleeps. But then the question sharpened into points that pricked about what I had decided regarding the will we had discussed months ago, and whether I had considered drafting a durable power of attorney, and whether I had spoken to my doctor about a DNR in case of a situation where heroic measures would be unnecessary. And he couched these inquiries in language like peace of mind and less paperwork for everyone, and the burden no parent wants to place on a child. And I felt Margaret's absence sit down at the table between us like an uninvited witness who would not allow me to lie to myself. I told him that I had a simple will and that it would be enough, that the house was mine until it wasn't, that a man who has navigated 76 winters can still sign his own checks and take his own pills and decide for himself when to see a doctor. And Daniel gave that patient nod again and said, "Of course, but the world is complicated now. There are forms and taxes and probate judges who can be as capricious as the weather. And besides, I should think about lifestyle, because there are communities in which people my age do better, places with classes and buses and on-site clinics and dining rooms where I would not have to eat alone." And he said the word alone the way a surgeon says tumor, as if naming it loudly enough might bully it into remission. The trout arrived pale and perfect, and I could taste the clean river inside it, yet every bite turned dry as chalk, while Daniel paged through the folder and slid across the table a neat stack of papers with colored tabs like little flags marking the territory he intended to claim. And he spoke about consolidating accounts and retitling the house and putting certain assets in a trust. And I looked down at the page where my name appeared above a line meant for my signature, and the room seemed to tilt just slightly, as if the river had tugged the building off its moorings. I said that I appreciated his effort, but that nothing here needed my signature tonight. Not while we were eating, not while the river made its quiet procession toward the Mississippi. And he put the folder away with a soft thud, as if he were returning a weapon to its holster, and he leaned back and asked me, in a tone that pretended to be casual, why I insisted on living in a house with stairs that could break my hip, in a neighborhood where nobody notices if an old man fails to light his porch for a week, with a refrigerator that is half empty because I cook like a widower who doesn't expect company. And he said there are statistics about falls and confusion and malnutrition, and that he had spoken to a doctor at a firm vent who said men like me often decline rapidly after a small crisis. And at the word decline, my fork paused in the air, because I heard in it a verdict, not a concern. And I asked him whether he had ever wondered why the album on his mother's nightstand is full of pictures of him as a boy, but there are so few of us together as men. And he did not answer, because he knew the answer, and because it would require him to admit that the law he practices now began as a law he wrote inside his heart the day he decided success was a door that closed behind him. The server brought coffee, and Daniel refused dessert and checked his watch and signaled for the check. And I felt the evening slipping like the river beneath us, the time for tenderness gone, the time for paperwork deferred, and I was almost ready to stand and say we would try again another day, when he leaned forward lowered his voice, and said something so precise and polished in its cruelty that I would later wonder whether he had practiced it in another mirror, perhaps the one in some hotel room where a man rehearses a closing argument. He said that I made everything harder than it needs to be, that I confuse pride with dignity and fear with independence, that he has to plan around my stubbornness the way a city plans around a river it cannot move. And then he looked at the line at the bottom of the bill, the blank where a tip goes, and said that old men like me do not realize how expensive their final years are for their children, not only in money, but in time and energy and the sorrow of watching a slow parade toward the same end everybody reaches. And he placed his palm on the leather folder and said, very softly, almost kindly, that if I was going to die, I should do it quietly without making a mess of things for once. The piano stopped, or maybe my hearing did, because the room drew back like a wave. The candle flame leaned and steadied. The server's pen scratched the check, and in that suspended second I felt the words burrow through my chest, as if looking for something soft to nest in, the way a parasite seeks warmth. I looked at my son and saw not a villain, but a man shaped by rooms I never entered and voices I cannot hear. A man who confuses efficiency with mercy and who believes that love is a transaction best handled by professionals. And I felt an urge to stand and shout, or to strike the table with my fist, or to walk out into the river's dark and let the current decide. Yet I also felt Margaret's hand, the invisible weight of it on my shoulder, pressing me into my chair, reminding me that a man's voice, once raised, cannot be taken back, that words thrown like stones do not always hit the target we intend. Daniel must have mistaken my silence for consent, because he slid the folder toward me again and said we could stop by the house for a quick signature, nothing dramatic, and then he could get on the road before the weather turned. And I smiled, a thin, tired smile I recognized from photographs of my father on the day he lost his farm. And I said I needed air. Outside, the river laid its cold breath across the parking lot, and the sky held that bruised color it gets just before a spring storm. Daniel stood beside me while the valet jogged off to fetch his car, and he said we should not dramatize things, that he hadn't meant it harshly, that he wanted what was best for everyone. And I looked at him and told him that sometimes what is best for everyone is simply to listen, to allow the old a little noise as they make their way toward the door, because silence has a cost that is paid by the living long after the dead are done with their bills. He nodded in the abstract way of a man who has already decided, and when the car pulled up, he hugged me quickly, the briefest press of expensive wool against my coat, and he said he would call next week to finish what we started. I watched the taillights bleed red into the river's reflection, and there in the wind, with the smell of wet stone in my nose, I understood that a line had been stepped over, that a sentence spoken almost tenderly could be as sharp as a blade, and that the quiet he had prescribed for my ending would not be the quiet I chose, because there are silences that protect dignity and silences that murder it, and I had been practicing the wrong kind for too long. The following weeks after that dinner by the river felt like walking across a floor that had begun to tilt without warning, every object in my house shifting just enough to remind me that stability was gone. Daniel did not wait long before pressing his advantage. He called twice in the same week, his voice honeyed but insistent, asking if I had thought any more about what we discussed, reminding me that it would save everyone trouble if I took care of the legalities sooner rather than later. I tried to deflect, telling him my health was holding steady, that I was managing just fine. But each call left me staring at the walls of my kitchen, hearing in his tone not the voice of a son, but the rhythm of a man negotiating property. I found myself replaying those words he had whispered in the restaurant, the poisonous phrase about dying quietly. And the more I repeated it in my mind, the more I noticed the subtle humiliations seeping into every interaction. When he visited again, this time bringing his wife Linda and their 2 children, I thought perhaps the presence of the grandchildren would soften things. I cleaned the house as if preparing for a sacred ritual. Laid out board games Margaret had once played with Daniel. Baked a pie with shaking hands because I wanted the smell of cinnamon to feel like home. But the visit was not about family. It was a silent tribunal staged in my own living room. Linda made comments about how the house smelled old, how the carpet must be difficult to keep clean at my age, how dangerous the stairs looked for a man with knees like mine. Daniel walked from room to room, nodding with a professional detachment, pausing before the photographs as though they were evidence in a trial. When Marcus asked if he could take his soda to the couch, Linda said no, because Grandpa's furniture was too fragile. The word fragile hung in the air, and I could not tell if she meant the chair or me. At dinner, I tried to ask the children about school, about their plans, but they shifted uncomfortably and answered in short, polite sentences, glancing at their parents for cues. Daniel finally interrupted me, saying the kids were under a lot of pressure, that I shouldn't burden them with long conversations. I wanted to shout that asking your grandchild about their life is not a burden, but the words clotted in my throat. Instead, I nodded, and the nod felt like a chain tightening around my neck. Later, when I offered the pie, Linda smiled thinly and said they had already promised the children ice cream on the way home, and Daniel added that sugary desserts were not good for me either, considering my age. I looked at the pie cooling on the counter, untouched, its crust slowly hardening, and I thought of Margaret's hands pressing dough with care, and I felt a humiliation so sharp I could not swallow my coffee. The evening ended abruptly. Daniel gathered his papers again, the same folder with colored tabs, and laid it on the dining table after the plates were cleared. He spoke in front of his children as though I were not there, saying that once Grandpa signed these documents, everything would be easier. No confusion, no wasted time when the inevitable happened. He used the word inevitable the way a man uses a crowbar, not to describe, but to pry something loose. The grandchildren sat silent, listening to their father describe their grandfather's decline as a logistical challenge, and I felt my hands trembling, not from age, but from rage. I asked if we could leave the subject for another time, that tonight was meant for family, not paperwork, and Daniel sighed, exchanged a glance with his wife, and said we would revisit it soon. They left in a cloud of expensive perfume and cold air from the front door, the children hugging me quickly as though they were patting the shoulder of a stranger. After they drove away, I walked through the house, every step echoing louder than it should have. I saw how they had looked at the photographs, at the furniture, at the very walls, and I realized that in their eyes I was already gone, that the house itself was more alive to them than I was. It was not just about inheritance. It was about erasing me in advance, replacing my presence with signatures and stamps, turning my life into a file they could close neatly. That night, as I sat by the window listening to the clock, I felt humiliation burn into resolve. Margaret's voice, faint but steady in memory, whispered that silence would not protect me. The escalation continued in smaller ways that cut deeper because of their subtlety. Daniel sent me brochures for retirement communities, glossy pictures of smiling seniors holding shuffleboard cues, and he underlined words like safety, companionship, no burden. Linda left me a message about a geriatric clinic in Chicago where specialists could assess whether I was still able to live alone. Even the bank called one afternoon, saying Daniel had inquired generally about procedures for managing a parent's accounts in the event of mental decline. They said it was routine, nothing unusual, but I knew the seed had been planted. Every phone call, every brochure, every polite remark about my age was a hammer, tapping at the same crack, the attempt to make me doubt my own strength, to make me hand over the keys to my dignity before death could take them. The breaking point came when I attended church one Sunday. A neighbor, kind woman named Carol, pulled me aside after the service and asked gently if it was true that I was planning to move into assisted living because my health was failing. My heart sank. Daniel or Linda had spread this whisper already, making preparations for a future they wanted others to believe was inevitable. I told Carol no, that I was still capable, that rumors were cruel things, but walking home, I felt a sting sharper than arthritis. It was not enough for them to press me in private. They were beginning to shape how the world saw me, laying the groundwork for a verdict of incompetence before I had even been judged. That night I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cold pie still on the counter, untouched since their visit. I cut a slice for myself, ate it slowly, the crust dry, the apples sour, but I forced it down as though swallowing a pledge. I told myself that humiliation could be fuel if one learned how to burn it properly. They wanted me quiet, compliant, folded neatly into the margins of their lives. But I had lived too long, carried too many burdens, loved too deeply to disappear like a smudge wiped from a page. The escalation had begun, and I felt, for the first time in years, the faint stirring of a fire in my chest that no one, not even my son with his polished arguments, could extinguish. The turn came quietly, as such turns often do, not with shouting or slamming doors, but with the careful precision of a blade sliding between ribs, disguised as concern, yet aimed at the heart of what little independence I had left. I was at the bank one afternoon, a place I had visited for years without complication, where the tellers knew my name and remembered Margaret's smile. When the manager, a young man in a too crisp suit, asked if I would mind stepping into his office. His tone was polite, but carried a hint of rehearsed sympathy, and I knew before I sat down that something had shifted. He told me that my son had been in touch, asking questions about procedures for managing accounts in the event of my incapacity, whether there were safeguards in place to prevent confusion should I become unable to handle my own affairs. And he framed it as standard, routine, nothing alarming. But the moment the words left his mouth, I felt my stomach tighten. Because it was one thing to be patronized in private, quite another to have the machinery of institutions begin to move around me, adjusting levers and cables, as though preparing for the moment when my signature would no longer be considered valid. I walked home slowly, the wind sharp against my face. And when I entered my house, I saw it not as a place of shelter, but as a fortress under siege, each familiar object already half claimed by hands that were not mine. On the kitchen table lay a pile of envelopes Daniel had left during his last visit, neatly stacked and marked with bright, sticky notes telling me where to sign. I had ignored them, but now I picked them up and read carefully for the first time. The language was dry, legal, but the meaning was clear. Durable power of attorney, living trust, transfer on death deed for the house. Each page spoke not of care, but of anticipation, as if I were already gone, as if my life were a waiting room for their inheritance. My hands shook as I read, not from weakness, but from anger, that they believed I would hand over the last fragments of myself so easily. The real blow, however, came not from paper, but from overheard words. A week later, Daniel returned with Linda and the children, supposedly for Sunday dinner. I was grateful at first, hoping to salvage something ordinary from the ruins. But as I carried dishes from the kitchen, I paused by the hallway and heard their voices through the half-open door to the dining room. Daniel was speaking in the calm, analytical tone he uses in court, saying that once I signed the documents, everything would be streamlined, that they could avoid probate, that there would be no drawn-out disputes. Linda added that it was better to manage me now rather than later when confusion might set in, and then she laughed softly and said it was remarkable that I still insisted on doing my own shopping and cooking, as if those small acts of survival were amusing eccentricities rather than lifelines. I stood there with a bowl in my hands, listening to my own children's voices reduce me to a problem of logistics, and I felt the weight of humiliation settle into something sharper, a determination not to go quietly into their tidy plan. That evening, when we finally sat down together, I looked at my grandchildren and tried once more to speak with them. I asked Marcus about his classes, and he shrugged, saying little. I asked Lily about her music, remembering Margaret's piano and how she had dreamed that someday her granddaughter would play those same keys. And Lily glanced at her mother before answering that she had little time for such things. Their eyes slid away from mine, as though they had been taught not to engage too deeply, and in that silence I understood how thoroughly Daniel and Linda had rehearsed them in the script of detachment. The dinner passed in strained politeness, and when it ended, Daniel again pressed the folder toward me, his voice steady, his gaze fixed. I pushed it back across the table and said, with as much calm as I could muster, that I was not ready to sign anything. Not now. Not while I could still decide for myself. His eyes flickered with irritation, and Linda's lips tightened, but they said nothing more, only gathered the children and left with promises to call soon. The moment the door closed behind them, I sat in my chair by the window and felt a shift inside me. Until then, I had endured the small humiliations with a kind of weary silence, telling myself that patience might soften their hearts, that time might bring understanding. But overhearing their words, reading the papers designed to strip me of choice, seeing the grandchildren coached into distance, it all cut too deep. It was no longer a question of whether they loved me enough to treat me with respect. It was clear they loved what they imagined would be theirs: the house, the accounts, the neat conclusion of my life without fuss or trouble. Margaret's voice arose in my memory again, urging me not to let the world shrink me into silence. And for the first time in years, I felt that voice merge with my own, forming a vow. That night, I could not sleep. I walked from room to room, touching the photographs, the furniture, polished by decades of care, the very walls that had absorbed laughter and grief. I realized that if I continued to wait passively, they would erase me while I was still breathing, turning me into a shadow who nodded politely while they divided the spoils. A decision formed in me, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I would not allow them to control my ending. I would not sign away my voice. I had lived long enough to know that dignity is not given. It is defended, sometimes at great cost. The midpoint of my story had arrived, and it was no longer about survival alone. It was about resistance, about refusing to let their version of me become the truth. I sat at the kitchen table as the clock ticked past midnight, and I whispered aloud to the empty room, "If I am to go, I will not go quietly." It was after that night of a quiet resolve that the battle I had been dreading began to unfold in earnest. No longer a series of hints and polite suggestions, but a campaign carried out in my own home and in the lives of those who still circled me. Daniel did not wait long to strike. He called less often, but when he did, his voice carried the cadence of a prosecutor, sharp, clipped, and final. And each conversation was built around the same refrain, that I was unprepared, that I was being reckless, that I was making things harder for everyone. He dressed these accusations in language of duty and love, but I had learned to hear the steel beneath the silk, and it rang in my ears long after the receiver was placed back on its cradle. I knew then that he had abandoned any pretense of gentle persuasion. He was ready to push. The next visit was orchestrated like a trial. They arrived not only as a family, but with Linda's brother, a financial planner who carried a laptop and spoke the language of balance sheets and tax efficiency. They spread papers across my dining room table as if it were a courtroom exhibit, explaining how much smoother everything would be if I consolidated, if I allowed Daniel to manage, if I relieved myself of the burden of responsibility. I sat at the head of the table and listened, my face still, my hands folded tightly in my lap, because I knew that if I allowed them to see my anger, they would call it confusion. If I let them glimpse my sadness, they would name it weakness. Linda offered me tea in the tone of a nurse coaxing a patient, while her brother clicked through slides of charts and numbers, all of which added up to a single conclusion: that I was an obstacle in the way of their tidy future. The children were present too, but they were not spared the theater. At one point, Daniel turned to Marcus and Lily and said that Grandpa was being difficult, that sometimes old men refused to do what was sensible, and he asked them if they wanted to see him comfortable or struggling, if they wanted to inherit a tangle of legal disputes or a smooth passage. The cruelty of using children as witnesses against their grandfather burned me more deeply than the papers or the charts. Lily shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting to me as if searching for a version of the truth that did not require her complicity, while Marcus kept his gaze fixed on the glowing laptop screen, nodding as though this were simply another school lesson. I felt my heart pound with humiliation and fury, and for a moment I wondered if I should rise from my chair and shout until the walls themselves shook. But instead I sat still and let them play out their performance, because sometimes silence is not submission, but a blade kept sharp until the right moment. They left that evening without my signature, but not without delivering their verdict. As Daniel gathered the papers, he leaned close and said in a voice pitched low enough that only I could hear, that I was making this harder than it needed to be, that he had spoken to an attorney who assured him there were ways to challenge capacity, if it came to that, and that it would be better for all of us if I cooperated now rather than forcing unpleasant proceedings later. The words lodged in my chest like stones. It was no longer a question of persuasion, but of threat. He was telling me, his father, that he was prepared to declare me incompetent. In the days that followed, the whispers spread further. At the grocery store, a neighbor asked kindly whether I was thinking of moving soon, because she had heard from Linda that the house was getting to be too much for me. At church, another congregant offered me a brochure for a retirement community outside town, saying Daniel had mentioned I was looking into it. The sense of siege tightened around me, as though my life were being rewritten in absentia, the story of my decline already drafted and distributed while I still woke every morning and brewed my coffee and read my newspaper. Each encounter left me both shaken and steeled, because humiliation can crush a man, but it can also become the coal that fuels a fire. The real confrontation arrived on a Sunday afternoon when Daniel called and insisted on a family meeting. I thought at first he meant something informal, but when they arrived, there was nothing casual in their demeanor. They had come to stage a reckoning. Linda carried a thick folder. Daniel was dressed in his courtroom suit, though it was the weekend, and even the children wore expressions rehearsed to appear solemn. They sat me at the dining room table like a defendant before a panel of judges, and Daniel began to speak in that slow, measured tone he uses when he wants his words to be unassailable. He said that my stubbornness was becoming dangerous, that my refusal to sign the documents placed everyone at risk, that if something happened to me tomorrow, the house would be tied up in probate, the accounts inaccessible, the funeral arrangements complicated, and that I owed it to my family to prevent such chaos. He framed it as duty, as sacrifice, but the undertone was clear. They wanted control now. Linda followed with her own speech, softer but no less cutting. She said she had been patient, but she worried about the children, about the stress this caused them, about how hard it was for Daniel to juggle his career with the additional responsibility of an aging parent who refused help. She looked at me with wide eyes brimming with rehearsed sympathy and said, "We just want you to have peace, Howard." "Why won't you let us give you peace?" And in that moment I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat, because what they called peace was erasure. What they called love was possession. Then, in a gesture that nearly broke me, Daniel placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder and asked him to read aloud a paragraph from one of the documents. The boy's voice cracked as he stumbled over the legal language, speaking words about transfer of property and designation of authority. And though he did not fully understand what he read, the humiliation was complete. They had turned my grandson into the mouthpiece of my own undoing. I felt my chest tighten, my breath catch, and for a moment I thought I might collapse, right there at the table, fulfilling Daniel's prophecy of frailty. Linda reached for her phone, perhaps ready to dial emergency services, but I steadied myself and forced the air back into my lungs. I would not give them that victory. Not yet. I pushed the papers back toward Daniel with a hand that shook not from weakness, but from rage contained, and I said that my affairs were my own until I decided otherwise, that no amount of pressure or parade of witnesses would change that. My voice trembled, but it carried, and for the first time in years I saw my son's face lose its professional mask. His eyes hardened, his jaw clenched, and he said, almost spitting the words, that I was acting like a selfish old man who would rather see his family suffer than admit the truth. And then once again, he let slip that poisonous phrase, delivered now without softness. If you're going to die, at least do it quietly. Stop making a mess. The children froze. Linda looked down, and the room seemed to contract around us. I rose from my chair, my legs unsteady, but my voice suddenly clear, and I told him that quiet is for the grave, not for the living, and that if he thought I would let him write the end of my story while I still had breath, he was mistaken. I told him that dignity is not inherited but earned, and that no son who speaks of his father as a burden will ever understand the weight of the sacrifices that built the very life he enjoys. The silence after my words was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the faint rustle of papers as Daniel closed the folder with a snap. They left soon after. Their departure marked not by hugs or promises to call, but by a brittle quiet that clung to the air like smoke. I stood at the window and watched them walk down the path, the children trailing behind, their figures receding into the distance. My heart ached, but not with weakness. It ached with the knowledge that the battle was no longer private, that lines had been drawn, and that my son had declared war not just on my possessions, but on my very right to be heard. That night I could not sleep. I sat in the living room, surrounded by photographs of a life they seemed eager to erase, and I realized that the time for silence was over. The escalation had reached its peak, and what came next would not be measured in folders or signatures, but in voices raised, in truths spoken aloud no matter the cost. I poured myself a glass of rye, held it up to Margaret's picture, and whispered, "They want me to die quietly, but they've forgotten I still have a voice." The breaking point came on a gray afternoon in early November, the kind of day when the clouds hang low enough to scrape the rooftops and the air tastes of iron. Daniel had called again, this time not to ask, but to inform me that he and Linda would be stopping by with the children because we need to resolve this matter once and for all. His voice carried the flat finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. I sat in my chair by the window after the call, staring at the bare branches outside. And I knew that whatever happened that day would mark the line between what I had endured and what I was prepared to fight for. They arrived just after lunch, their coats heavy with cold, their expressions already set into the masks of duty and determination. Daniel carried the same folder. Linda carried a notepad. And the children trailed behind with eyes that flickered nervously between their parents and me. I offered coffee, but no one accepted. Instead, they took their places around the dining table as though assembling for a tribunal. Daniel spread the documents out again, his hands steady, his tone sharp. He said the time for delays was over, that I was endangering my family with my obstinacy, that the responsible thing was to sign now and spare them further strain. Linda added that they had consulted with a notary who could come within the hour, that everything was prepared, that all that was required was my cooperation. Something inside me, something that had been simmering for months, broke open then. I rose slowly from my chair, every joint aching, but with a steadiness I had not felt in years. I looked at the faces around the table, at my son's tight jaw, at Linda's polite mask, at the children's bewildered eyes, and I felt Margaret's presence in the room, as though she were standing just behind me, her hand on my shoulder. My voice shook at first, but I let it rise, let it gather strength. I told them that I had listened in silence long enough, that I had swallowed humiliation after humiliation, that I had heard my own son speak of me as though I were already gone, as though my life had been reduced to a balance sheet and a set of complications to be managed. I turned to Daniel and repeated the words he had whispered in the restaurant, the words he had spat in this very room, the words that had burned like acid in my chest. Die quietly. The air seemed to freeze. The children stared at their father. Linda's eyes widened, and Daniel's face flushed crimson. I told them all that those words had shattered something inside me, that no child who could say such a thing to his father deserved the inheritance he was so desperate to secure. I told them that the house they coveted would never be theirs, that I had already made arrangements with a lawyer in town to leave it to the local veterans' home, a place where men who had known hardship and loyalty would find shelter. I said the accounts would bypass Daniel and Linda entirely, divided directly among the grandchildren when they came of age, so that whatever remained of my life's work would go to the only future worth believing in. And I said that if Daniel wished to contest it, he could do so publicly, but he would do so knowing that his children had heard the truth of his cruelty from my own mouth. Daniel tried to interrupt, to raise his voice, but mine carried over his. I told him that love is not a ledger, that sacrifice cannot be measured in efficiency, that dignity is not his to grant or revoke. I reminded him of the nights I had worked double shifts so he could attend college, of the years Margaret had gone without new dresses so we could pay his tuition, of the countless meals she had cooked and the prayers she had whispered for his success. I said that everything he stood upon had been built from our labor and our love, and that to repay it with contempt was a betrayal deeper than theft. My hands trembled, but not from fear. I slammed my palm against the table and felt the papers scatter, their neat rows of signatures and clauses breaking apart like brittle bones. The children sat frozen. Marcus's eyes brimmed with tears. He tried to blink away, while Lily's face crumpled as though something she had long suspected was finally confirmed. Linda pressed her lips tight, but for once she had no words. Daniel rose from his chair, his voice rising in anger, accusing me of manipulation, of poisoning the children against him, of being delusional. But I met his fury with a calm that surprised even me. I told him that what poisoned the children was not my words, but his, that they had heard their father speak of his own father as a burden, and that such wounds do not close easily. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the clock ticking above the mantel, each second hammering home the truth that had been laid bare. Finally, Daniel gathered the scattered papers, shoved them back into the folder, and stormed toward the door, Linda hurrying behind him, her face pale. The children hesitated, looking at me with eyes that seemed to beg for guidance, and I told them softly that they should remember kindness, that no matter what anger filled the air today, they must never forget that family should be built on love, not fear. They followed their parents out, the door slamming shut behind them, and the house fell silent again. But it was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence after a storm, heavy but cleansing. I sank into my chair, exhausted, every muscle trembling, but my chest felt lighter than it had in years. I had spoken the truth aloud, and though it had fractured the fragile shell of family that remained, it had also restored something I thought I had lost forever, my own voice. They had wanted me to die quietly, but instead I had shaken their world with words that could not be unsaid. I knew there would be consequences, perhaps estrangement, perhaps bitterness that would never heal. But I also knew that I had drawn the line they would not cross, that I had reclaimed the dignity they had tried to strip from me. That night, as I sat alone with a glass of rye, I looked at Margaret's picture and whispered, "I did it, my love. I did not go quietly." And for the first time in many months, I felt that she was smiling. In the days that followed the confrontation, the house felt both emptier and fuller at once, as though by casting out their demands and their papers, I had cleared space for something that had been suffocated too long. Silence no longer pressed on me like a coffin lid, but stretched wide around me like a field after harvest, barren yet honest, nothing hidden, nothing festering. Daniel did not call, not even to feign civility. Linda sent a brief message through a neighbor that they were disappointed, but would respect my decision, words so bloodless they might as well have been cut from a template. I did not expect contrition, and none came, yet I felt no regret. I had spoken, and in speaking, I had drawn the line between what was mine and what they wished to take. A week later, I met with my lawyer, a man younger than Daniel, but steadier, who listened without interruption as I explained how I wanted my estate handled. We finalized the documents, placing the house in trust for the veteran's home, dividing what money remained into accounts earmarked directly for the grandchildren. He asked if I was certain about bypassing Daniel and Linda, and I told him certainty was all I had left, that I would rather leave my legacy in the hands of children not yet fully shaped than in the grasp of those who had already shown how casually they could discard the very source of their blessings. When the pen scratched across the paper, My signature felt heavier than any I had ever written, but it was not the weight of surrender. It was the weight of justice, of choosing at last to defend myself with the only weapon left to me, the truth. Sealed in ink, word spread, as it always does in a small town. Neighbors stopped me in the store or on the church steps, some offering sympathy, others quiet admiration, a few simply shaking their heads as though the story were too painful to believe. I did not care for gossip, but I knew that by speaking aloud, by refusing to be silenced, I had changed how people saw me. No longer the quiet widower drifting toward invisibility. I had become the man who had stood against his own blood and claimed the right to finish his life on his own terms. That reputation might not heal the rift in my family, but it gave me back the dignity Daniel had tried to erase. The grandchildren came once, without their parents, slipping through the door on a Saturday afternoon. Lily sat at the piano and touched the keys tentatively, playing a few broken notes of a song Margaret used to hum, while Marcus walked the rooms with wide eyes, as if seeing them for the first time, not as a future inheritance, but as the story of a life. They did not speak much, but when they left, Lily hugged me tightly, whispering that she was sorry, that she understood more than her father thought she did. It was a small gesture, but it warmed a place in me I thought had gone cold forever. I knew they would be pulled back into their parents' orbit, that the distance might grow again, but I also knew that the seed of truth had been planted, and seeds have a way of waiting for the right season to grow. I began spending more time at the Veterans Hall, sharing meals and stories with men who had also lost families to time or neglect, men who understood the slow erosion of respect that comes with age. Among them, I was not a burden, but a comrade, and when I told them of my decision to leave the house to the hall, they clasped my shoulders and said it would be a home for many, long after I was gone. For the first time in years, I felt my life expand beyond the narrow corridors of humiliation into a horizon of purpose. At night, I still sit by the window with a glass of rye, watching the streetlights flicker across the quiet road. Margaret's photograph rests on the table beside me, her smile unchanged by time, and I speak to her as though she were still in the next room. I tell her that I am no longer afraid of silence, because it is mine now, not theirs, chosen, not imposed. They wanted me to fade quietly, to become invisible, to vanish without voice or fight. Instead, I have turned my silence into a shield, and my words into the echo that will remain after me. I know I will not live forever, that the body weakens and the nights grow longer. But I also know that when the end comes, I will meet it not as the man they tried to make of me, small and compliant, but as the man who stood in his own house and declared that his dignity would not be signed away. My son may never forgive me, but perhaps one day, when his children ask him why they remember their grandfather's words so clearly, he will understand that a man's voice, once raised in truth, cannot be silenced even by death. That is my final comfort, and perhaps my final victory.